June 6, 1944, 5:25 a.m. The English Channel groaned beneath the weight of history. A cold mist hung low over gray waves, swallowing entire fleets in silence. Inside the landing craft, American Rangers clutched their rifles, seasick and pale, staring at the dark horizon that flickered with distant thunder. The smell of diesel, sweat, and fear mixed with salt water. Then light. The first German artillery rounds tore the fog apart, splintering the air into chaos. Mortar fire clawed the sea. Men ducked instinctively, praying the next shell would find someone else. Across the gray water, the coastline of Normandy burned in brief flashes, each one revealing the silhouette of concrete bunkers carved into the cliffs. In the confusion, a soldier whispered to himself, "This is it." And as the ramp slammed down, they ran into a storm that would change the course of the war and force German generals to confront the truth no one in Berlin dared admit. In the winter of 1943, the Allies faced a single monumental question: how to return to Europe. The Soviet Union was bleeding the German army on the Eastern Front, but Joseph Stalin demanded what he called the Second Front, a Western invasion that would finally divide the Wehrmacht's strength. For Winston Churchill and Franklin Roosevelt, this meant more than strategy. It meant redemption. France had fallen in mere weeks in 1940, and the world had watched democracy retreat behind the Atlantic. In London's underground war rooms, maps of northern France were unrolled, marked with pins and tide tables. Operation Overlord, the code name for the largest amphibious invasion in human history, began as lines of ink on paper. But behind those lines stood over 150,000 men, 7,000 ships, and an industrial machine unmatched in human history. Planners studied the French coast relentlessly. Normandy, with its long beaches and access to deep-water ports, became the chosen point of assault. It was not the obvious choice the Germans expected: Calais, the shortest route from England. That expectation would become one of the Allies' greatest weapons. The deception plan, Operation Bodyguard, turned illusion into strategy. Fake radio traffic, inflatable tanks, even a phantom army under General George S. Patton convinced German intelligence that the main invasion would strike Calais. German reconnaissance flights photographed rows of fake landing craft along England's southeast coast, unaware that the real invasion fleet assembled hundreds of kilometers west. As May 1944 approached, General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force, walked a tight line between optimism and dread. Every forecast mattered. Every tide counted. A single week of bad weather could destroy everything. On June 4th, high winds and low clouds forced a delay. Allied soldiers waited in camps, restless and silent, unsure if the invasion would ever come. Meteorologists warned that the Channel's fury would not calm soon. Yet a brief break appeared in a narrow window of calmer seas predicted for June 6th. Eisenhower gathered his commanders in a dimly lit room at Southwick House. His decision came without theatrics. Only a quiet sentence that sealed history. "Okay, let's go." That night, the invasion moved. Paratroopers of the 82nd and 101st Airborne jumped into darkness over Normandy. They landed amid chaos: hedgerows, flooded fields, and scattered units. Behind them, the sea filled with the thunder of engines. Allied convoys stretched horizon to horizon, the largest armada ever assembled. Far away in occupied France, the German High Command was unprepared for the storm about to break upon them. Adolf Hitler slept. Field Marshal Rundstedt and Field Marshal Rommel had warned that the Atlantic Wall was strong in concrete, but weak in readiness. Rommel, convinced the Allies would strike during rough weather, had returned to Germany for his wife's birthday. As the first paratroopers landed and the fleets approached, the German command structure began to fracture under its own weight, a system built to obey, not to react. By dawn, the fate of Europe was already sealed in motion. The invasion had begun. Across 2,400 miles of coastline, the German Reich had built what propaganda called Der Atlantic Wall, a chain of fortifications stretching from Norway to the French border with Spain. It was meant to be impregnable, a wall of concrete and steel capable of throwing any Allied invasion back into the sea. To Hitler, it symbolized the invincibility of his empire. To Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, it was a dangerous illusion. When Rommel was appointed Inspector of Coastal Defenses in late 1943, He toured the beaches of northern France and saw immediately what few dared to admit. The wall was hollow. The bunkers were scattered, their fields of fire uneven, and many beaches lay undefended except by token garrisons of poorly equipped troops, older men, convalescents, and units composed of forced laborers or captured conscripts from Eastern Europe. Rommel understood the new reality of modern war. If the Allies established a beachhead, if even one army got ashore, Germany could never throw them back. The Luftwaffe was crippled, its fuel supplies dwindling. The Kriegsmarine was outmatched. The only hope was to destroy the invaders at the water's edge. So he ordered thousands of Rommel's asparagus wooden stakes tipped with explosives planted across tidal flats to tear open landing craft. He reinforced bunkers with thick concrete, positioned machine guns in interlocking arcs, and demanded artillery be moved closer to the beaches. But time was running out. By May 1944, he still had fewer than 50 divisions to defend all of France and only 7 in Normandy itself. The elite 352nd Infantry Division guarded Omaha Beech, its men veterans of the Eastern Front, disciplined, experienced, and fatalistic. To them, the idea of facing an American invasion felt both absurd and inevitable. Inside the bunkers overlooking the channel, soldiers lived a routine of boredom and watchfulness. They cleaned their rifles, brewed ersatz coffee, wrote letters home to families they hadn't seen in years. When the sea fog rolled in, they stared out into the void and wondered when or if the invasion would come. Each morning began the same: seagulls, surf, and silence. Yet beneath that calm, German intelligence was uneasy. Allied radio signals had increased. Reports hinted at troop buildups in southern England. Still, the deception campaign worked perfectly. The Oberkommando der Wehrmacht believed the main blow would fall on Pas-de-Calais, not Normandy. Normandy was considered a diversion. On the night of June 5th, Rommel left his command post to visit his wife for her birthday. Rundstedt remained in Paris, trapped in indecision by Hitler's rigid command structure. The Führer had forbidden local commanders from moving armored divisions without his personal approval, a fatal flaw. In the early hours of June 6th, the sky over Normandy flickered with distant flashes. Paratroopers had begun to fall. Telephone lines buzzed with confused reports. Enemy landings near Sainte-Mère-Église, possibly airborne. The staff officers hesitated. They needed confirmation, authorization, and orders from Berlin. None came. Then, at dawn, lookouts along the coast spotted a horizon that seemed to move not with the tide but with ships. Thousands of them, battleships, transports, landing craft, and destroyers, formed a living wall of steel. The illusion of the Atlantic Wall cracked in an instant. A sergeant at one bunker is recorded as muttering, "This is it. The invasion has come." Minutes later, the first shells began to fall. Concrete shook. The sea erupted. And deep within German command centers, phones rang unanswered as the greatest invasion in history stormed toward their shores. At 06:30 a.m., the ramps dropped. The men of the U.S. 1st and 29th Infantry Divisions, alongside the elite 2nd and 5th Ranger Battalions, stepped into a torrent of bullets and surf. Each wave landed farther from its intended point, dragged by wind, current, and smoke. Many never even reached the beach, weighed down by gear. They sank beneath the waves before firing a single shot. Those who made it to shore found no cover, only chaos. The tide carried bodies, helmets, and rifles across the sand. Machine guns from the bluffs above opened up with terrifying precision, cutting entire sections down in seconds. Veterans would later say that Omaha Beech didn't sound like war. It sounded like machinery. Mechanical, relentless, cold. But among the terror, fragments of leadership and courage surfaced. Small groups of soldiers, realizing they were alone, began crawling toward the seawall. Engineers tried to clear obstacles under direct fire, attaching explosive charges with trembling hands. Rangers carrying rope and grappling hooks searched for paths up the cliffs. There was no grand plan, only survival, instinct, and courage in motion. The tactical angle. When plans collapsed on paper, the invasion was a masterpiece of coordination. A 40-minute naval bombardment, followed by precision airstrikes, then infantry landings under softened defenses. In reality, the bombardment fell short. Most shells overshot the cliffs, detonating harmlessly inland. The bombers, blinded by clouds, missed the beach entirely. The German fortifications, untouched and waiting, emerged from the smoke intact. Landing craft scattered in the rough seas, dropping men miles from their assigned sectors. Tanks meant to provide cover for amphibious Sherman sank in deep water, victims of rough surf and overloaded weight. Of the 29 assigned to Omaha, only a handful reached land. The entire tactical sequence unraveled within minutes. Officers were cut down. Radio operators lost contact. The beach became a graveyard of plans. Yet paradoxically, this chaos created opportunity. Small units acted on instinct, not command. Rangers climbed where they could. Infantrymen used wreckage as makeshift shields. No one coordinated them, but collectively, they began to push forward inch by inch, yard by yard. What the Allied command feared as failure was transforming into a brutal, improvised victory born of human resilience. The enemy perspective, shock inside the bunkers. From their concrete shelters high above the beach, German gunners could hardly believe what they saw. Wave after wave of landing craft advanced through smoke and shellfire. Even as the sea turned red beneath them, the Americans kept coming. Private accounts later revealed disbelief among the defenders. One machine gunner of the 352nd Division recalled, "They were madmen. They ran straight into the fire." The Germans fired until their barrels glowed, until the smoke choked the air inside their bunkers. But still, the beach filled with movement-crawling figures, medics dragging the wounded, engineers blowing gaps through the obstacles. When ammunition ran low, some defenders tried to signal artillery support, but communications were breaking down. Wires were cut, radios jammed, officers shouted orders that vanished into the roar of explosions. Inside one command post near Vierville-sur-Mer, a German lieutenant scribbled in his log, "Enemy everywhere. Cannot distinguish units." The beach was lost in smoke. By the time he set down his pen, the Americans were already halfway up the bluffs. The defenders began to understand what Rommel had feared all along, that no amount of concrete could hold back a nation that refused to stop moving forward. The battle was no longer a plan. It was a struggle of willpower, chaos, and endurance. And as the tide rose higher on the bloodied sand, the fight for Omaha entered its most desperate phase. By 07:30 a.m., the beaches of Normandy were drowning in confusion. Every pre-invasion plan had collapsed. The radios were silent, the air cover scattered, and the enemy still owned the high ground. In Omaha, the chain of command was no longer a line. It was fragments of courage spread across the sand. General Norman Dutch Coda, assistant division commander of the 29th Infantry, landed with the second wave. He was 51 years old, a career soldier, and he stepped into hell carrying only a pistol and a whistle. All around him, men were pinned down behind the seawall, too terrified to move. Coda understood at once that the only thing holding the invasion together was human will. He walked through the fire, shouting orders that cut through the chaos. "Your Rangers! Lead the way!" It wasn't a speech. It was survival spoken aloud. Under his command, scattered squads began pushing through breaches, using explosives and bayonets to carve narrow paths up the bluff. At Pointe du Hoc, Colonel James Earl Rudder and his Rangers scaled 100-foot cliffs under machine gun fire. Their ropes slick with seawater and blood, they reached the top with barely 90 men left standing and discovered the massive German guns had already been moved inland. Even so, they pressed forward, destroying the hidden batteries before they could turn on the fleet. Rudder's men held that position for 2 days against repeated counterattacks, outnumbered nearly 5-1. These were not textbook maneuvers. They were acts of improvisation, decisions made in moments that rewrote the fate of the invasion. Leadership at Omaha was measured not by rank, but by whoever stood up when everyone else stayed down. Technology had promised to make Omaha Beach a triumph of modern warfare. Reality turned it into a brutal lesson in humility. The specialized landing craft, the Higgins boats, proved both a marvel and a curse. Designed for shallow approaches, they brought men close enough to step into battle, yet offered almost no protection once the ramps dropped. The soldiers' lives depended on the timing of engines, the tides, and the steadiness of frightened pilots steering through smoke. The amphibious tanks, nicknamed DD tanks for their canvas flotation skirts, were meant to be the beach's first armored support. But as they rolled off the transports, heavy waves swamped them. One after another disappeared beneath the channel. Only a few reached shore, their engines choking on salt water. Yet those few became mobile fortresses for advancing infantry. Engineers wielded the tools of innovation amid devastation. Bulldozers cleared wreckage under sniper fire. Demolition teams blasted lanes through minefields. Signalmen unrolled lines of communication across open sand. Every success came at a price. Every foot gained was paid for twice. And above them, the machinery of the modern world thundered destroyers close to within a mile of the beach, firing point-blank at German positions. Their guns shook the earth so violently that one sailor later said he could feel Normandy's soil through his boots. In those hours, the war's technology ceased to be an instrument of precision. It became an extension of human endurance, a battlefield of steel and instinct, where innovation and courage merged into one. As the smoke thickened and the tide swallowed the fallen, something irreversible began to happen. Scattered American units, though destroyed, started breaking through the German defenses. The impossible was starting to unfold the moment the invaders became the unstoppable force. By mid-morning, Omaha Beach looked like defeat. Smoke rolled across the surf, shrouding the wrecks of landing craft and tanks. Waves carried debris helmets, rifles, shattered wood mixed with the cries of wounded men, calling for medics who would never come. The tide kept rising, threatening to drown those still pinned behind the seawall. For a moment, even seasoned commanders thought the invasion might fail. Yet inside that despair, something began to change. At the western end of the beach, near Vierville and Pointe de la Percée, scattered ranger units regrouped. Out of hundreds, barely a few dozen remained in fighting shape. They used hand signals instead of radios, grenades instead of orders. Crawling through trenches and craters, they began scaling the bluffs, picking their way through minefields, barbed wire, and sniper fire. Nearby, small groups from the 1st Infantry Division did the same. Sergeant John Ellery, pinned beneath a ridge of shale, saw a break in the fire pattern, a 2-second pause as German gunners reloaded. He motioned his men forward, sprinting 30 yards before the next burst. Those 30 yards became the difference between life and annihilation. Above them, German defenders inside their bunkers began to feel something they hadn't since the early years of the war: doubt. Their machine guns overheated, ammunition belts ran low, and the endless waves of Americans kept advancing. One bunker commander, Oberleutnant Firking, later admitted in his report, "We thought them mad, but they never stopped. Every time we fired, more appeared." By 09:30 a.m., isolated American units had reached the first German trenches. They cleared them in brutal close combat grenades, bayonets, and raw instinct. Each bunker that fell opened another path upward. The beach that had been static for hours suddenly became alive with movement. Offshore, Allied destroyers moved dangerously close to the beach, disobeying their orders to maintain distance. From barely 1,000 yards out, they fired directly into the cliffside, their shells slamming into concrete bunkers at near-flat trajectory. The precision and ferocity of this naval gunfire broke the backbone of several strongpoints. German positions began to crumble. Within minutes, communication between the coastal batteries and inland command fell silent. Telephone lines were severed. Commanders shouted over radios that no longer worked. One German officer at Saint Laurent recorded the final coherent message he received that morning: "The enemy is inside our positions. We cannot hold it." The Americans, once trapped on the beach, were now among the bunkers themselves. The impossible ascent of Omaha had begun. From the bluff tops, the view was unthinkable. The entire shoreline, miles long, filled with movement, smoke, and ships, still pouring men into the fight. What the Germans had assumed was a limited assault was now revealed as something far greater. The sheer scale of the invasion became undeniable. For the first time, German field officers began sending frantic requests for reinforcements. But their calls were met with silence or delay. Higher command still believed Normandy was a diversion. Panzer divisions remained idle near Calais, waiting for an attack that would never come. Omaha was no longer just a beach. It was the fracture line of the Third Reich's Western Front. As morning bled into noon, and as the first American flags were hoisted atop captured bunkers, a grim realization swept through German command posts. The Atlantic Wall, the wall Hitler had promised would never be breached, was falling piece by piece under the weight of sheer human will. By noon on June 6th, the German command network in northern France was in chaos. Reports arrived in fragments, some claiming victory, others total collapse. Telephone lines were dead, radio frequencies jammed, and the fog of war turned confusion into paralysis. for every officer still fighting on the coast. There were 10 waiting for orders that would never come. At 12:15 p.m., Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt received his first clear message from Normandy. It was brief, desperate, and raw. The enemy landed in great strength, all along the front. Situation critical. He ordered immediate counterattacks, but to move the armored divisions, he needed Hitler's direct approval. That order never came. The Führer, convinced that the main invasion would still strike Calais, refused to release the panzer reserves. He slept through the first hours of the invasion. His staff refused to wake him without confirmation. By the time he rose, the Atlantic Wall was already collapsing. Field Marshal Rommel, returning from Germany, heard the news mid-journey. His driver recalled him staring out the car window in silence before saying quietly, "It's begun. May God help us all." He knew what the others in Berlin would not yet admit, that the battle was already lost. On the ground, Allied progress accelerated. Small breakthroughs became connected lines of advance. Engineers cleared roads, medics established aid posts, and artillery began landing inland. The bluffs overlooking Omaha were now in American hands. Through captured observation points, U.S. officers could see deep into the Norman countryside and the routes toward Caen, Bayeux, and Saint-Lô. From these same vantage points, the Germans saw something far worse. The sea itself had turned into an army. The horizon was filled with ships, transports, destroyers, cruisers, all unloading endless waves of men and steel. No matter how many they killed, more came ashore. By early afternoon, the 352nd Infantry Division, the pride of the German coastal defense, had ceased to exist as a coherent unit. Its regiments were shattered, its command posts overrun. Survivors retreated inland, hunted by naval gunfire and strafing aircraft. A few scattered counterattacks fizzled under relentless pressure. At 2 p.m., Rundstedt telephoned the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht in frustration. "If you do not withdraw these men, you will lose the West." His warning was ignored. Berlin believed Normandy was a distraction. Even as field reports flooded in, beaches lost, bunkers captured, lines disintegrating, the high command refused to acknowledge reality. Inside Hitler's headquarters, General Alfred Jodl hesitated before delivering the latest situation map. The invasion front stretched nearly 60 miles and 5 beaches, all active, all advancing. The Luftwaffe could not fly. The Kriegsmarine could not sail. For the first time in the war, the German generals faced a power greater than their armies: inevitability. By the evening of June 6th, Rundstedt and Rommel both reached the same conclusion. The invasion could not be stopped. The only rational move was to halt further counterattacks, preserve remaining armor, and retreat to secondary defensive lines before the Allies broke fully inland. They pleaded for permission to withdraw to save what was left. Their request was denied. When Hitler finally addressed his generals late that night, he ordered a counteroffensive at dawn. Tanks were to strike the beaches and throw the enemy back into the sea. It was a command divorced from reality, one no longer tethered to the battlefield. The men who had seen Omaha with their own eyes knew what the maps in Berlin could not show. The sea itself was now American. In one of his final recorded conversations that day, Rommel's tone was devoid of hope. "We are facing an enemy who commands the air, the sea, and the will of destiny. We can no longer hold France." At that moment, the great myth of German invincibility, the illusion of the Atlantic Wall, finally shattered. As the sun set over Normandy, the thunder of naval guns faded into a haunting stillness. The beaches were scarred, the sea red, the wind heavy with the smell of smoke and cordite. But among the wreckage, American engineers and medics were already at work, turning conquered sand into a bridgehead. D-Day had not just succeeded. It had redefined the war. Dawn on June 7, 1944, revealed a coastline unrecognizable from the morning before. The once fortified beaches of Normandy were now littered with the wrecks of 2 armies, shattered bunkers, twisted landing craft, burned-out tanks, and thousands of bodies. The tide carried back helmets, rifles, and the floating remains of those who had fallen in the surf. Yet amid the devastation, something extraordinary had taken root: order. American engineers worked tirelessly through the night, turning what had been chaos into an organized invasion port. Bulldozers carved new roads through sand and debris, medics established field hospitals in captured bunkers, and supply officers began unloading hundreds of tons of ammunition, fuel, and food. By mid-morning, the first tanks were rolling inland through freshly cleared lanes. In less than 24 hours, the United States had done what Germany believed impossible, landed an army across open beaches under fire and held the ground. What German propaganda had promised to be a steel wall had proven no more than a sandcastle against the tide. The Allied foothold stretched 6 miles deep by noon. Communication lines re-established, artillery repositioned, and the beaches renamed Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword, each now a living symbol of defiance turned to triumph. On the German side, disbelief turned to despair. Messages from frontline commanders grew fragmented and desperate. Reports described entire battalions missing, artillery batteries destroyed, and ammunition depots overrun. Many officers no longer trusted Berlin's orders. They made decisions simply to survive. Field Marshal Rundstedt, once Germany's most respected strategist, sent his bluntest message to the High Command. "The war in the West is lost unless we make peace now." No response came. The order from Hitler was unchanged: defend to the last man. But there were no last men. There were only the wounded, the exhausted, and the scattered remnants of an army fighting ghosts, fighting the past, not the present. Behind the lines, the German civilian population would not learn the truth for weeks. Radio Berlin announced that the Allied landings had been contained. Newspapers printed stories of heroic counterattacks. In reality, by June 9th, 150,000 Allied troops were ashore, supported by 50,000 vehicles and protected by near-total air superiority. Every hour the beachhead expanded. For the Americans who survived Omaha, the victory felt hollow. Medics and chaplains spent the day gathering the fallen over 2,400 men killed or wounded in just a few hours. Chaplain Captain John G. Burkholder later wrote, "We buried them facing the sea. The same sea that brought them here. The same sea that took them home." The German soldiers captured on Omaha were stunned not by defeat, but by the scale of it. They had been told the Allies would never dare a cross-channel invasion, and that their defenses were impenetrable. Many stared silently as endless columns of American vehicles rolled past. Stretching from the shore to the horizon, one prisoner was heard whispering, "It cannot be real. No army could be this large." And yet it was. By the end of D-Day +1, the American army had achieved the largest seaborne invasion in history, a feat no military power had ever matched. The beaches of Normandy, once symbols of Nazi pride, had become the front line of Germany's undoing. The invasion had done more than breach the coastline. It had shattered the illusion of German control. Within a week of the landings, the beaches of Normandy had become something the German generals had never anticipated: a living organism. Roads, airstrips, fuel depots, and communication hubs were spreading across the French coast like veins of an unstoppable giant. Every hour ships poured more men and supplies onto the sand. What had once been an invasion was now an occupation in motion. By June 12th, the Americans had linked Omaha and Utah into a single front, creating a continuous Allied line across the Cottontail Peninsula. Infantry units pushed inland, liberating small villages one by one, while engineers bridged rivers and cleared minefields that had taken months for the Germans to prepare. The German 7th Army, responsible for Normandy's defense, was collapsing under the weight of logistics and morale. Many units were fighting without ammunition, food, or radio contact. Some commanders reported fewer than half their men still capable of fighting. The myth of Fortress Europe, the idea that Hitler's Atlantic Wall could hold forever, had dissolved in less than 10 days. In Berlin, the atmosphere was suffocating. Hitler demanded counteroffensives that no longer existed on paper. When Rommel tried to argue that withdrawal was the only way to save the army, he was met with fury. The Führer's reply was chilling: "The enemy must be destroyed on the beaches or there will be no Germany left to defend." But the reality on the ground was undeniable. Allied air power ruled the skies. German armor, once feared, could not move by day without being obliterated by fighter bombers. Every convoy, every supply train, every moving truck was hunted from above. The Luftwaffe, crippled by fuel shortages and outnumbered nearly 20-1, could offer no relief. In the field, German soldiers began surrendering in groups, sometimes entire platoons waving white flags. Many officers, especially veterans of the Eastern Front, confessed disbelief. They had never seen such coordination, such overwhelming material power. The Americans fought not just with courage, but with an inexhaustible machine of logistics behind them. By late June, the Allies controlled over 330 square miles of French territory. The port of Cherbourg was under siege, and British and Canadian forces were tightening the ring around Caen. The Germans could no longer maneuver freely. They could only delay the inevitable. Field Marshal Rundstedt, in one of his final acts before being dismissed, made a final appeal to the High Command. "Make peace, you fools. You cannot win this war anymore." His plea sealed his fate. Hitler replaced him with Field Marshal Günther von Kluge, but the replacement changed nothing. The outcome had already been written on the shores of Normandy. Behind Allied lines, the tempo of victory accelerated. By mid-July, the Americans had landed nearly 1 million men, along with 150,000 vehicles and 500,000 tons of supplies. Entire divisions were now flowing across the beaches daily. Normandy had become an industrial port built out of courage, engineering, and blood. For the German generals, the psychological toll was immense. Many began referring to Normandy as das Grab der Wehrmacht, the grave of the army. Those who had once believed in the invincibility of German arms now spoke of defeat as destiny. Even Rommel, the desert fox himself, would soon face an impossible moral dilemma, one that would end his life before the year was out. By August, the Allies would break out of Normandy and race across France. Paris would be liberated, and for the first time in 5 years, the German people would hear the sound of enemy bombers not as a distant terror, but as a herald of their own downfall. The invasion of Normandy did more than reclaim France. It broke the psychological spine of the Third Reich. Every German general who had begged to halt the invasion knew the truth that day on Omaha Beech. The war they had started could no longer be won. In the end, Omaha Beech was not remembered for its beauty, nor for its blood, but for what it symbolized the moment when courage overcame certainty. The Germans had believed their wall of concrete and steel could outlast any storm. But the storm that came on June 6, 1944, was not made of weather. It was made of men. Every inch of that sand costs lives. Every crater, every torn flag, every silent body was a reminder of how fragile victory truly is. Yet from that devastation rose a bridge to freedom built not by machines, but by the will of soldiers who refused to turn back. The American Rangers who scaled the cliffs at Pointe du Hoc, the medics who dragged the wounded through surf and shrapnel, the engineers who turned chaos into landing zones all became part of a single truth: that liberty demands a price too heavy for one generation alone to bear. For the German generals, Omaha marked the beginning of an end they could no longer control. The tide they had once believed eternal had turned. And for the world watching from across oceans and borders, it was proof that tyranny, no matter how fortified, could be undone by courage, unity, and sacrifice. When the guns finally fell silent months later, and Europe stood scarred but breathing, the echoes of Omaha still lingered. The sea that had carried death now carried hope. And beneath the white crosses that lined the cliffs above Normandy, the story of that day remains written not in words, but in silence. Because history does not remember June 6th as a mere battle. It remembers it as the morning when the free world returned to Europe and never left again.